That's the legacy that we're building on today. Carbon capture that creates an entirely new industry. An affordable, low-carbon grid that's doubled, that draws on all of Alberta's strengths. And a low-carbon oil pipeline that bolsters our independence.
That's the PM there on his new energy deal with Alberta that includes changes to the industrial carbon pricing system. Alberta's premier says construction of a West Coast pipeline could start as early as September 2027. What does it tell us about the Liberals' approach? How are they balancing new energy policies and climate commitments? Let's bring in our Sunday Scrum. Aaron Wherry is a senior writer for CBC here in Ottawa. Ian Bailey, a reporter for the Globe and Mail, also in Ottawa. Justin Ling is a columnist for the Toronto Star, and he's in Montreal today. Good to see you all, gentlemen. I'm going to start with Aaron, even though we've talked about this deal in the newsroom 16 times together. But I'll start with you, Aaron, in terms of what that announcement on Friday told you about the Prime Minister's level of ambition and his approach to energy and climate.
Well, I think he made some pretty big compromises in terms of policy on the climate front. I think the government's argument, and you heard it a bit in the clip you played from Dominic LeBlanc, is that they now have greater policy certainty as compared to what was left behind by the Trudeau government. And you can definitely argue that the Trudeau government's policy was stronger on paper, but that this one, has a bit of a better chance of standing the test of time because it now is backed up by political consensus and agreement from Alberta. Mm-hmm. It is, though, at the end of the day, a weaker climate policy, and that makes it harder to see how you get to net zero. And so I think, I think it's good for the Prime Minister to have shown that he can work with Alberta. We can't ignore where the discussion in Alberta is going and the possibility of a referendum. But, that aside, he's, I think, now got a significant responsibility to explain how this country is on a credible path to net zero, because it's no longer quite obvious what that looks like.
Yeah, and Ian, I should say that we had a briefing, a technical briefing, as they're called, on Friday with officials, and you ask officials and you ask ministers, well, what's the modeling now in terms of these emissions? No one's willing to offer up any of the numbers, so it's hard to know. They seem to think they'll get there, but I couldn't tell you where the evidence of that is.
Yes, and I think the Prime Minister was talking about this in Alberta after the announcement, and he was pointed and I wouldn't say indignant, but forceful in saying that he is committed to dealing with climate change. He will get there. We will get to net zero and these other goals. I think that where we are now, I think it's hard to, if there was no sovereignty threat in Alberta, I wonder if we would have come to this point with a pipeline, with the deal on pricing emissions. I mean, I think the sovereignty issue in Alberta has sort of defined the government's approach to the basket of issues that we're talking about today. And the Prime Minister, though committed to dealing with the changing climate, has had to deal with that. Mm-hmm. It has to deal with the prospect of a sovereignty vote of some sort later this year, coming at a time when we're obviously facing sovereignty issues from the United States. So I think that has defined the policy that was announced, the deal that was announced earlier this week.
It sure sounded, though, Justin, like the Prime Minister also wants a pipeline. He's committed to climate change, but he really sounds like he's also committed to a new pipeline.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know how we can get away from that. I mean, he has been hinting at this going back to the campaign. I think he's been kind of softening up the country, I think even his own party, around the idea. And I think he's more than happy to sort of, hang it on to Danielle Smith and kind of put it in front of people as a solution for, what is the potential sovereignty crisis that could be facing us. But I think, plain facts are he wants a pipeline because he recognizes it will increase production, it will increase revenues, it will increase GDP, tax revenue at a time when we need all of those things, where we need new trading partners, particularly in Asia. I think this is, intimately linked with the threat from the U.S., changing global landscape, changing energy market, even OPEC fracturing. This fits into all of that stuff. I think people who focus exclusively on our own climate targets, ignore the fact that there are trade-offs that have to be had here, right? We do need to figure out a way of increasing overall GDP growth, overall productivity, and this is a route there. I'm not sure he's, to your point, sold that yet, but I think it's something he's going to have to get really good at doing in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, what do you make of that, Aaron, that this is about, economic growth and the climate stuff, for lack of a better word, will come later on. But this is about doing something for the country right now.
Yeah, look, you can make an argument for a pipeline, and I think the Prime Minister has at least made it much harder to argue that it's the federal government that's standing in the way of a pipeline.
Sure. Yeah.
And he's gone so far down this road that it's hard to imagine he isn't at least open to the idea. I think there's still a lot to be asked about where the Pathways project lands. And I think, as much as climate policy has, I guess, slipped off the radar politically, and as much as the Liberals have a bit of an advantage here in that of the two major parties, they're the only ones that show any interest in climate policy. I don't know that you want to go so far down the road, in terms of emissions or in terms of politics that, when the next election rolls around, you can't say, here's what the path to net zero looks like. Here's what our serious climate policy looks like. I think there is eventually going to be some kind of price to pay for that. And I think it's a potential vulnerability they need to be mindful of.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about those politics in the next hour. But, it is kind of shocking, Ian, to think that there's one Prime Minister Trudeau, who bought a pipeline, and that there's potentially another Liberal Prime Minister who's going to help facilitate a second one. That is, I think a remarkable moment. I know Conservatives would say, let's see if he gets there. But still, the conditions are being laid out.
The conditions are being laid out, and another, federal Conservatives might say one thing, but obviously one of the most prominent Conservatives in the country, Danielle Smith, is working with the Prime Minister on this. They're both connected on this. This has to succeed for both of them. Building on something that Aaron said, today the Prime Minister has public opinion support to proceed with this approach. Sure. It's all good. Next week, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks, 4 months from now, we've seen how polls can reverse. And there may be progressive voters out there who may balk at this whole approach. Avi Lewis is out there, the new NDP leader, and he has a ton of challenges to get his party going. But this opens up some political space for him to sort of work in to try and get some votes back. And that's going to be, and there are also progressive voters within the Liberal coalition. So that's going to be a challenge for Mr. Carney of, in due course, if, keeping those voters on side, because obviously he's going to be judged on this in an election at some point in due course.
I'll give you the last word there, Justin.
Yeah, listen, this needs to succeed now. We're now talking about a situation where if this pipeline, if there is in fact a proponent, in the offing that comes forward with an actual plan to build a new pipeline and it doesn't work, we're going to be talking about an even worse national unity crisis than to begin with. If it does go forward, we could also be facing a serious national unity crisis, whether it's Alberta versus BC, Alberta versus Quebec, Alberta versus everybody. We don't really know yet. It will be the Prime Minister's responsibility to sort of explain to us on the back end how this is justified. Pathways is one of those things, big multi-billion-dollar carbon capture project that is still sort of undefined at this point. Based on the timelines we've gotten over the last week, it's entirely possible we're going to have a pipeline approved, built, and in operation before Pathways even really begins. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing right there. But, it's worth underlining that this deal with Alberta has kept the industrial output carbon pricing, which was never a given. And in fact, Alberta has agreed both to price floors for those credits, as well as to guaranteeing the long-term price of some of those credits. So this is a thing the Prime Minister could underline as an actual effective thing he's gotten here. Yeah. Alberta's long-term commitment to carbon pricing, which was never a given.
Yeah, and that's sort of how he's justifying it, for sure. I actually have time for one more. So, Aaron, the thing we haven't mentioned here is that there still has to be a private proponent. And Alberta seems very confident one will emerge, but I don't know who that is or where that comes from at this stage.
Yeah, I don't, look, Friday's agreement was a big deal, but I think there's a lot here that still needs to be clarified, including Pathways and this private proponent. The Alberta government, rather, has been talking about that for a long time. Let's see if one actually comes forward.
I regularly speak with Premier Eby. He and I had a good conversation yesterday about a range of subjects, including aspects of what we announced today. I'm looking forward, actually, I will be seeing the Premier in Vancouver next week.
The Prime Minister there on speaking to the BC Premier, because obviously BC has concerns. First Nations, some First Nations on the coast have concerns about a new pipeline. How likely is it that the Prime Minister and the Premier will be able to get people on side for a pipeline? What's the political pushback inside the Liberal caucus? Let's bring back our Sunday Scrum. Wherry, senior writer here at CBC. Ian Bailey, politics reporter for the Globe and Mail. He's also here in Ottawa. Justin Ling, columnist for the Toronto Star, and he's in Montreal. Good to see everyone again. So now I want to talk about all the prickly things that are in place here because of this deal. And Ian, I'm going to start with you about BC, because Premier Eby was not subtle in his language on Friday, saying that Ottawa is rewarding bad behavior. What does the Prime Minister have to do here then, do you think, in this meeting that he's going to have with the Premier this week?
Well, he moved, the federal relationship with Alberta Premier Smith to a place of kind of unity and smiles and handshakes and signed memorandums. He has to do the same thing with David Eby in British Columbia. It's quite that. It's as simple as that. Mr. Eby has outlined a number of projects that he says need federal action, projects that are in the interest of the province. And Mr. Carney is going to have to find some way to sort of do the work that his government has done with Alberta, with BC. This pipeline that Ms. Smith wants to build, that the federal government is supporting, it's not going through Narnia or something. It's going through the province of British Columbia, and so they have to work this out. That meeting in Vancouver next week with the Prime Minister and the Premier hopefully will be the beginning of a similar major movement to the one that led to what we're talking about today earlier this week in Alberta.
I mean, Narnia would be easier, certainly, to get a pipeline built in Narnia. Justin, it's interesting because the Prime Minister says, obviously, that this is an example, or so does the Premier of Alberta, of cooperative federalism working. But it also opens up the complaint from other provinces, or the potential that other provinces are going to come along and say, what have you done for me lately?
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is the start of kind of bribery federalism. I guess maybe not the start, but it's certainly a continuation of it, maybe an intensity of it. Yeah, I mean, you're going to be in a situation where you're going to need to be doing a lot of bilateral deals with provinces to make up for the fact that you just made a lot of concessions for Alberta. It's not going to be, I don't think, as hard as maybe it sounds, right? You know, Quebec is going to be upset that Ottawa has more or less sold the farm when it comes to carbon pricing. But at the same time, Quebec's actually been offside the federal carbon price for quite some time. It's been selling carbon credits below what the federal target is. So this change actually kind of helps Quebec in a strange way. So there's going to be a lot of weird dealing going on into the near future. And frankly, I think there's going to have to be some sort of recognition, that this revenue, if it comes on, if this pipeline goes forward, if it gets built, is going to have to sort of support industry across the country. This can't just be a windfall for Alberta. What that looks like, I'd be shocked if anyone even knows yet. I mean, this is such a big, thorny issue. Even figuring out the route, figuring out how you increase capacity at the Port of Vancouver to actually take this oil to Asia is going to be difficult enough. And so I don't think they've actually started on the complex calculus that goes into keeping the rest of the provinces happy.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to me the much harder piece here, Aaron, the can of worms that is to come.
Yeah, and I think if you go back to the last time we had a pipeline on the table, it was ultimately, BC government obstacle that forced the Trudeau government to buy a pipeline and then build one. I think if that example kind of offers some lessons, they're sort of twofold. One is, if the government and BC decides to throw regulatory and legal obstacles at you, that can get pretty messy. But I think the flip side of that is that if the federal government expends some effort to, make the pipeline palatable to the public, that can, broadly succeed. There were lots of fears when the Trudeau government approved that pipeline, and then when they bought that pipeline, that Liberals were going to get wiped out in British Columbia, and this was going to be, there were going to be massive protests, and there was no way that this was going to end well. And it, ultimately the pipeline got built, and many Liberal MPs in that province kept their seats.
Yep.
So I think it's possible to get that pipeline through there with some public acceptance, but I think a lot depends on how much of a fight David Eby's government wants to put up.
Okay, so let's talk about then the problems potentially inside the Liberal tent. You all alluded to it a little bit in the last hour, but there is a climate caucus inside the Liberal caucus, Ian. Certainly Stephen Guilbeault has been upset in the past, left cabinet largely because of this deal. How does the Prime Minister go about managing that there are people inside the tent, inside the caucus who don't like what's happening here?
Well, he's popular enough. He has revived this party. They're ahead in the polls. They're doing well with the public, and maybe that may be enough to sort of keep the team on side going forward in the short term. Mr. Guilbeault has been ambiguous about whether he may leave depending how things turn out, but maybe Mr. Carney is popular enough that he could even shrug off a Guilbeault exit. Going back to BC for one quick second, what Mr. Eby said, I think, is Mr. Eby is a New Democrat, and obviously there are complicated NDP politics provincial NDP politics on pipelines, but I think that what Mr. Eby said is something that a BC Liberal or even a BC Conservative Premier might have said. So the challenge for Mr. Carney is whether he can sort of be the Prime Minister who sort of comes to this big accommodation. It's a big challenge, and bring BC in. And it's worth noting there are a lot of seats in BC. The Liberals are competitive in the Lower Mainland. They're competitive in various parts of the province, maybe more competitive seats than Alberta. So there's a real political interest for the Liberals, I think, in having a news conference where David Eby comes in and he is smiling like Danielle Smith was smiling.
Yeah. Justin, do you think people inside the Liberal tent could make this very difficult for the Prime Minister?
Yes, but I don't think it's going to be the people you think it is. So Stephen Guilbeault, for sure, resigned from cabinet to some degree in protest of the government's kind of oil and gas policies. But I'm told he's actually been pretty collaborative with Carney's office over the last couple of months. I'm told the Prime Minister's office calls him pretty frequently, and he picks up, he offers advice. He has not been the thorn in their side that maybe we were expecting him to be. Meanwhile, you have Jonathan Wilkinson, who I think it was kind of angling to be that kind of grumpy Gus in caucus about, the deprioritization of climate. He's off to Europe now, so he's gone. Here's what's interesting. So I was talking to a caucus source last night. There's a clear need for the Liberals to have a champion in BC who can come out and actually make the case for this pipeline and sort of some of the climate deals around it. You would think that would be Gregor Robertson, kind of their biggest high-profile MP cabinet minister out on the West Coast. I'm told that Gregor Robertson joined a caucus call this week, basically made clear he was extremely unhappy with the final deal with Danielle Smith, and basically said, don't call me tomorrow, I'm not going to be available. So, and he was notoriously missing from a big LNG announcement on the West Coast as well. So you don't actually have a big champion right now. Carney does not have a lieutenant in BC who's selling this deal. I think that's very telling. On top of the fact that there's also been some kind of disgruntlement about Gregor Robertson's delivery as housing minister, you have to start to wonder, does Mark Carney need to find a new sort of lieutenant for British Columbia who can actually convince Eby and the province and his caucus that this is going to work out? Never mind the problems you have in Quebec, where there's also a number of MPs who are apart from Guilbeault who are unhappy about this. So this is a difficult political question, and Mark Carney does not love solving difficult political questions, at least for his own caucus.
About 45 seconds to you, Aaron.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that he could use a credible voice. Mark Carney could use a credible voice in British Columbia to sell this pipeline. Justin Trudeau, whenever this came up, would always talk about the fact that he had spent time in BC. I think the other flip side of this is that this climate caucus that we've heard about in fits and starts for the last few months, I'm interested to see whether it starts to flex some muscle, maybe publicly. There's not only this pipeline question, there's also the question of regulatory reform and the impacts of that. I think look, I don't think that you're going to see some massive rebellion in the Liberal ranks, but I do think that, especially given the size of the majority, that there is a chance here for Liberal MPs to actually flex some muscle and exert some influence. And I'm interested to see whether they take that opportunity.
The thing I love most about this was when Justin Ling said his wild Saturday night included talking to a caucus source. Aaron Wherry, Ian Bailey,
in between
Justin
first and
Ling.
second period of the Habs game.
Okay, good. Enjoy the rest of your long weekends. Thank you all so much.